Hey guys, this video is for sophomore US. This is the lesson we were going to do today. But I'm really glad that we instead talked about the horrible events in Washington on Wednesday. You know, with the Capitol being stormed. We really lived through something horrible, something historic, and something that should have never happened. But again, like I told you guys earlier, please do not lose faith. Doing what they did was a sign of weakness, not of strength. And our country does not belong to people like that. So I just want you to keep that in mind, even though it was for sure something horrible to see and should never have happened. Well, this wasn't the first time that bad things happened in this country, because in many ways there have been a lot of parallels recently drawn between current times and the 1850s. Things were so divided in the United States in the 1850s between the slave-owning states and the free states. And the thing is that it was kind of like a rolling snowball in the 1850s. You know, like a snowball going down a mountain, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The same sort of thing was happening with regard to sectional tensions. It was one thing after another. The Fugitive Slave Law, then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, then the Charles Sumner beating, then the Dred Scott decision. And this was yet another nail in the coffin of sexual relations we're going to talk about today, the debate over the Lecompton Constitution. Now, remember, the Kansas-Nebraska Act actually said that the people of Kansas would decide for themselves if they wanted slavery. The whole principle of popular sovereignty. But remember, that resulted in bleeding Kansas in the 1856, where extreme pro-slavery people and extreme free soilers or abolitionists rushed into Kansas in order to affect the vote on whether Kansas was going to have slavery or not. Violence ensued. 200 people were killed in the violence. John Brown was probably the most famous person to come out of the bleeding Kansas situation when he killed 5 pro-slavery guys, and he had actually bigger plans, which we're going to talk about in class on Monday. So the whole situation was incredibly violent and divisive. And still, we don't know whether Kansas is going to be a free state or a slave state. There was a legislature in Kansas. There were 2 legislatures. One in Lecompton, which was a pro-slavery legislature, which was elected because of a lot of vote rigging, the real deal, not the kind we've been hearing about lately, the fake kind, but a lot of vote rigging by the border ruffians, by pro-slavery people. They rigged the vote to make sure that Kansas would have a pro-slavery legislature. And then the Free Soilers set up their own legislature in Topeka, Kansas. Now, President Buchanan wanted Kansas to decide if they wanted slavery. He wanted the Constitution to be ratified, whatever they decided, and then he wanted statehood granted, so Kansas would come into the Union as a state. But the elections in Kansas were so fraudulent that it made popular sovereignty impossible. Now, the thing is that if you're going to rely on people voting, which is very problematic to begin with, that people are going to vote on whether they want to have something immoral in their territory, but if that's going to be your policy, you have to have legitimate elections, right? Elections actually mean something, and that is not what we had in Kansas. It was fraudulent elections. Now, there was an election that was held in 1857 in Kansas for a constitutional convention. Because the Free Soilers believed that the pro-slavery people were just going to rig the election anyway, they boycotted it. So that guaranteed that a pro-slavery convention would actually be elected, right? That's actually, if we were in class, it's always a debate whether that makes any sense to boycott an election. If you boycott an election, you're definitely going to lose. But by boycotting it, you're basically saying, I'm not going to give it any legitimacy. So, yeah. Now, needless to say, because the Free Soilers boycotted the vote for the convention, the Constitutional Convention, excuse me, the delegates that were elected to the convention were pro-slavery people, and they drew up an infamous constitution, the Lecompton Constitution. Now, the Lecompton Constitution protected the rights of slave owners in Kansas, and it said that we would decide later whether more slaves would be allowed to be admitted into Kansas. So basically, the Lecompton Constitution was a pro-slave constitution. So and when a territory votes for constitution, it then has to be approved by the federal government. So Buchanan was faced with a real dilemma. Lecompton was clearly a violation of popular sovereignty, right? Because everybody did not get a chance to vote, even though they boycotted it. But there was no popular sovereignty to speak of that actually drew up that constitution. Only 10% of voters in Kansas actually participated in the constitutional convention that drew up that constitution. And the future decision to allow more slaves, remember they said there's going to be a vote on whether we're going to have more slaves, that could be rigged too, just like every election in Kansas was being rigged. But Buchanan also had reason to accept the Lecompton Constitution, the pro-slavery constitution. The base of the Democratic Party was the South, and they certainly wanted Kansas to come in as a slave state. Very few slaves actually lived in Kansas. I think there were only 2 slaves in all of Kansas. So Buchanan and people could say, well, it doesn't really even matter. Well, to those 2 slaves it does, but it doesn't matter in the scheme of things whether they allow slavery, slavery to continue when there were hardly any slaves there anyway. And every other future territory, when you looked at the map of the United States, every other future territory was probably going to vote against having slavery. Like Nebraska wasn't going to, the Utah, the Mormons wasn't going to, Oregon wasn't, New Mexico wasn't. So Kansas was really the South's last chance to actually get a slave territory. So Buchanan said, well, will it hurt? They get one. The North is going to get all those other territories. So Buchanan in late 1857 decided to endorse the Lecompton Constitution and actually say it should be ratified. Now, the thing is that this pretty much ripped apart the Democratic Party when Buchanan came out for the Lecompton Constitution. Remember, Stephen Douglas was the man who wrote the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the father of the whole principle of popular sovereignty. And Douglas and most Northern Democrats broke with President Buchanan. And they actually said that the Lecompton Constitution is not legitimate. Because it wasn't really voted on by the people of Kansas. Douglas was also appalled that the people of Kansas never would get to vote in the Constitution itself. Remember, the election voted for delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and then that convention would, drew up the Constitution. But the people of Kansas never actually voted on the Constitution. So that troubled Douglas. Douglas actually argued in opposing the Lecompton Constitution, I do not care if slavery is voted up or down. Remember in his debates with Lincoln, that was a consistent thread, right? That he didn't care about them debating the morality of slavery. But this Constitution smacks of trickery and jugglery to defeat the will of the people, which is absolutely true. Now, another election was held, always having elections in Kansas, but they're always rigged. Another election was held for a new territorial legislature for Kansas. But just to give you an example of how blatant the fraud was in Kansas, there was one city in Kansas with 30 voters, but 1,600 pro-slavery votes came out of that one city. So Trump would have a good time with this, right? This is real fraud, right? It's going on with Kansas. And the governor of Kansas rejected the returns. Because he said that this is not legitimate. So Kansas wound up having a free soil legislature after so many rigged pro-slavery votes were thrown out. One thing I should say is that by this time, Kansas had an overwhelming free soil majority. The free soilers actually outnumbered the pro-slavery people by 4 or 5 to 1, which makes the fact that Lecompton, a pro-slavery constitution, was even being debated at all. It made it even more outrageous, considering the fact that 80%-ish of the people of Kansas were free soil. Now, this new free soil legislature that Kansas had called for a vote on the Lecompton Constitution, straight up. Now, the voters could decide, and this is while President Buchanan continues to endorse the Lecompton Constitution. So, the voters could decide on the present and future condition of slavery in Kansas, basically, by voting on this Constitution. Now, an election was called by the pro-slavery legislature. Remember, they had competing legislatures. An election called by the pro-slavery legislature was boycotted by the Free Soilers again, and they passed the Lecompton Constitution. But the next election, which was boycotted by the pro-slavery forces, because that was called by the Free Soil legislature, rejected the Lecompton Constitution. So, more competing results, right? Now, Buchanan was still determined to try to get Congress to pass the Lecompton Constitution. because of the first time when they drew it up and all of that business. But Congress, the U.S. Congress refused. Congress has to approve constitutions for territories. So Congress refused to ratify the Lecompton Constitution because they said we have to have another referendum, a real referendum on where everybody gets to vote. It's a fair vote. So the people of Kansas, for a final time, when they voted, and this was as honest an election as they ever were going to get in Kansas, rejected the Lecompton Constitution. It was voted down. So Kansas ultimately came into the Union as a free state. Even though Buchanan had his way back in when he first came out, it would have been a slave state. So Buchanan's actions regarding the Lecompton Constitutions were completely incompetent, and they also made sectional tensions worse than ever. Now even the Democrats were split over slavery. Right, the Whig Party already died because they were so divided over the slavery issue. We have the new Republican Party, which is purely a Northern party. The Democratic Party is one of the few institutions that actually had a solid Northern wing and a Southern wing. So it was a bisectional party. But now, because of the fight that Buchanan had picked over Lecompton, basically the Democrats themselves were divided, with the Northern Democrats, believers in popular sovereignty, did not support the Lecompton Constitution, and then the Southern Democrats, who of course supported the Lecompton Constitution. So now the Democrats themselves were divided, and just in the broader sense, it just confirmed Northern suspicions about President Buchanan, that he was just basically a tool of the slave power. That he was a Northerner, but he would just basically do the bidding of the Southerners. And his meddling in the Dred Scott case, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, already people thought that. But what he did with Lecompton just kind of confirmed it in people's minds. Now, with regard to Stephen Douglas took a position of principle. He was for popular sovereignty, and he felt the Lecompton Constitution was a violation of popular sovereignty. So he came out against it. So that made him a hero in the North, but it made him a villain in the South. That he basically was trying to block the one territory that could possibly have slavery. He wanted to block it from being admitted to the Union as a slave state with a pro-slavery constitution. So it made him a villain in the South and among Southern Democrats, which was important because Stephen Douglas was one of the most important politicians in America. President Buchanan was really old. He probably was not going to run for a second term. So most people looked to Stephen Douglas as the likely Democratic nominee for president in 1860. But if he lost all this Southern support as a result of his stand against the Lecompton Constitution, then it was going to be very hard for him to get the Democratic presidential nomination in 1860. So what was going to be the future of the Democratic Party going forward, which again was one of the only bisectional entities left in American life by this time. All right, guys, very good. So remember, hopefully you watch this video from start to finish. On Monday, we're going to talk about the John Brown raid, which was one of the most significant events that actually led to the final break between North and South. So I'm also going to on Google Classroom, I'm actually going to post a homework assignment for you as well. So I will have a great weekend, and I will see you all on Monday. Peace.